This is YouTube. There is no shortage of doom predictions here. The housing crash has been imminent every day since the last crash in 2008. Every day someone screams that this is the year that everything finally collapses. But if you zoom out from the panic and the thumbnails with flames behind houses, something odd happens. The crash that everyone imagines never actually shows up. So what's going on? Well, because there is turmoil in real estate right now. Real turmoil. And yes, the markets are absolutely taking hits, and we'll talk about that. But the next chapter of real estate will not look like the crash that millions of people are suddenly hoping for. You see, if you understand why, you can navigate what's coming instead of being hoodwinked by TikTok economists. What if there is a crash, but it looks nothing like you thought it would or what you were hoping for? So what's with the gallon of milk? Well, it's for this very gallon of milk that you won't see a crash, or at least it won't look like what you're expecting at all. In psychology, there's a term of confirmation bias called motivated reasoning, where you look for data to support your hypothesis, influenced heavily by your bias. These doomers cherry pick the data to support their thesis, and a lot of people secretly want a 20 to 30% housing crash. I get it, not because of economics or data per se, but because of psychology. You look at your neighbor's house who bought their house for 40% less than yours, and you feel a little sting of injustice. You think, if the housing crashed, maybe I'd finally get my own cosmic do-over. And then there's regret. It's the same feeling you get when you think, man, I wish I bought Bitcoin in 2010. You didn't, I didn't. So you're hoping that life hands you a kind of second shot. And listen, I get it, but that justice people are waiting for isn't built on anything except envy and regret. And because of that, there's also a misunderstanding of the economic foundation underneath. Because when you look at the actual mechanics of housing, two things become crystal clear that control housing prices: supply and demand, and fiat currency. These two forces alone explain why the crash won't look like people want it to. To have a real housing crash, like a falling off a cliff 20% collapse, and not some humble price reduction that gets called a crash, my personal pet peeve, you need demand to fall hard and fall fast. Historically, when does that happen? When jobs disappear, like a lot of jobs. Take the Rust Belt. When manufacturing left, housing just didn't decline, it collapsed. Whole regions hollowed out. That is what a real crash looks like. But where are we now? Well, we're in the exact opposite situation. Huge demand, not enough supply, millions of millennials and Gen Z forming households. Sellers are locked into low rates and refusing to sell their houses. And in many cities, builders underbuilt houses for an entire decade. And yes, some markets are correcting: Austin, some parts of Florida, and a few others. And in these cities, they either overbuilt or they lost a decent amount of jobs. But those are local weather patterns, not a national climate. Now, doomers love to point to those cities like Austin because it fits their narrative, but they skip the part where Austin is an exception and not the rule. So if you want a discount, sure, move to an overbuilt market or a city losing employers. But if you're waiting for a national Black Friday 30% off sale, well, supply and demand just doesn't support that fantasy. At least not today. This is the second piece of the puzzle. Remember, two things make housing go up over time: growth of the city, more people, more jobs, and printing of money by the Federal Reserve. And that second part matters way more than people want to admit. Our money is being debased aggressively. Now, momentarily slowed down, sure, but certainly not reversing. Now, politicians will always choose inflation over recession because inflation hides the pain. It buries recessions under higher prices instead of letting them collapse asset values as maybe they should. So let's give the devil his due. If you subtract inflation out of the equation, a lot of housing may already be crashing. If the real inflation adjusted value of a house is flat or negative, you could call that a crash, or at least a modest one. But that hardly makes headlines. But nominal prices, the ones on Zillow, well, those are floating on top of a sea of printed money. And you can have a real crash that doesn't look anything like a crash. And that's exactly the world we're living in. So take this gallon of milk. If you had a time machine, you could go back and stockpile milk when it was pennies on the dollar. Bring it back today and resell it for a huge profit. Heck, you don't even need a time machine. If you know the price is going to be 10 times the price in a few years, you could just buy a bunch now. You'd be a genius. But you can't, because milk rots. It has a shelf life. Real estate doesn't rot like milk. Yes, properties wear out, roofs fail, plumbing leaks, but the land, the hard asset doesn't spoil. And when your currency is being diluted, hard assets become the smart place to put your money. That's why during eras of high inflation, housing prices don't tend to crash. They don't fall across a cliff, they float, even if the real value underneath is struggling. And that's the part that almost nobody thinks about, because on paper, it looks like everything is going up. The Zillow and Redfin prices are going up, and politicians get to say the economy is robust. But what's actually happening? Well, that's where things get interesting. Most people look at rising home prices and assume it means that homes are becoming more valuable, and although that's technically true, the truth is trickier, way trickier, and it has a lot less to do with houses are getting better and a lot more with what's happening to the money itself. Because if your currency is quietly shrinking, then the price tag on every asset starts drifting upward. Not because the asset is suddenly magical, but because the dollar underneath it is softening. And once you see that, it completely reframes who actually wins and loses in this system. A real housing crash, the kind that YouTube keeps on promising, would legitimately help some people. It would help first-time homebuyers, it would help renters trying to enter the housing market, it would relieve pressure on young families stuck competing with investors and downsizers and every other buyer in the ecosystem. But a real crash would hurt a very long list of powerful players: homeowners, banks, local governments, pension funds, developers, politicians, and everyone who depends upon property taxes or mortgage-backed assets staying strong. And that's the part that nobody wants to say out loud. There are simply too many institutions whose survival depends on housing not crashing in nominal terms. And if you're gonna get in the comments and say it shouldn't be that way, I agree with you. But that doesn't change the state of the world. You can shake your fist at the sky, but that doesn't change reality. So what do we get instead? Well, we get the softer version, the version where prices look stable or rising, while the actual buying power underneath gets eaten away. That's the environment we're in right now. And it's why local reverses still happen, because local economies shrink, employers leave, and builders overshoot demand. These micro crashes do matter. They're real and they hurt real people. But they don't add up to a nationwide collapse. And that brings us back to this gallon of milk. Because if your money is quietly losing strength, then owning a hard asset isn't just a financial choice, it's a survival choice, and dare I say, a good one. The milk spoils and the dollar will evaporate, but the land underneath your feet, well, that doesn't rot. And in an inflation-heavy world, housing then becomes a beautifully poetic shelter in the storm of inflation. Subscribe for more tips.